"Sir, you need to move. This seat is not for you." The words landed clean and sharp inside the quiet first-class cabin of Flight 117, as if the air itself had tightened around them. Jessica Moore stood by the aisle, posture rigid, eyes scanning the man seated by the window like she had already decided the outcome before hearing a single reply. Marcus Caldwell didn't react the way most people would expect. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't even shift in his seat. He simply looked out through the oval window where clouds drifted over the United States like slow-moving waves, as if the world beyond the aircraft mattered more than the tension building beside him. Behind Jessica, Ryan Blake stepped closer, arms folded, his tone lower but laced with certainty. "We've had issues with seating mismatches before," he said, glancing at Marcus's plain black shirt and unbranded jacket. "If there's been an error, we can fix it quickly." The implication was clear even without being spoken aloud. First class was a place they believed required validation beyond a boarding pass. A few rows back, passengers began to shift in their seats, sensing the change in atmosphere. Emily Carter, seated near the aisle, noticed everything. The way Jessica avoided eye contact with Marcus. The way Ryan hovered too confidently, as if authority had already been granted. Slowly, Emily lifted her phone, not dramatically, not obviously, just enough to record what her instincts told her would not end quietly. Marcus finally turned his head slightly, eyes calm, voice even. "There's no mistake," he said. His tone wasn't defensive. It was factual, almost detached, like someone confirming a weather report. Jessica exhaled through her nose, unimpressed. "Sir, we've checked the boarding list. This seat has been flagged for reassignment." The cabin grew quieter, the subtle kind of silence where strangers stop pretending not to listen. Ryan stepped forward again, this time closer to the overhead compartments. "We can avoid embarrassment here," he added, softer now, as if offering a courtesy rather than issuing a warning. Marcus closed the folder on his lap and placed it beside him with deliberate calm. That folder contained nothing that anyone in that cabin could recognize as important, yet its presence seemed to steady him more than anything else. Somewhere in the cockpit, Captain Daniel Reeves reviewed the flight manifest, unaware that one name on that list would soon fracture the balance of everything he thought was routine. Marcus finally spoke again, quieter this time, not to Jessica, not to Ryan, but to the space between them. "You're looking at this the wrong way." And for the first time, Jessica hesitated, not because she understood, but because something in his certainty didn't match anything she had prepared for. Jessica Moore held her position by the aisle, but something in her expression had shifted, a subtle uncertainty she did not fully understand yet. She glanced once at Ryan Blake, expecting reinforcement, and then back at Marcus Caldwell, who remained seated with an unusual stillness that felt less like compliance and more like certainty. The cabin lighting reflected softly off the white interior panels, making everything feel colder, more distant. Ryan leaned slightly toward Jessica and lowered his voice. "If he is not in the system correctly, we follow procedure," he said, trying to regain control of the moment. Jessica nodded, but her eyes kept returning to Marcus, as if waiting for him to break character, to become what they had already decided he must be. Emily Carter, 2 rows behind, continued recording, her phone now steady in her hand. She was no longer just curious. She was alert to every detail, every shift in tone, every hesitation that did not belong in routine service. Marcus finally reached into the side pocket of his seat and pulled out a slim tablet. He did not unlock it immediately. Instead, he placed it on his lap like he was waiting for something to align. Jessica noticed the device and frowned slightly. "Sir, if you are attempting to access reservation details, that will need to be handled through the crew," she said, her voice tightening with professional insistence. Marcus looked up at her calmly. "I am not attempting anything," he replied. "I am confirming what already exists." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made Ryan pause. At that moment, a soft notification chimed in Jessica's earpiece, and she turned slightly away to listen. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly, confusion flickering across her face as she processed something from the internal system. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Daniel Reeves reviewed the updated passenger manifest and noticed a flagged entry he did not remember seeing before. The name was highlighted with a discrete priority marker that required verification. He leaned slightly forward, scanning the line again, then reached for the internal communication line. In the cabin, Ryan decided to escalate. "Sir," he said more firmly now, "we are going to need you to stand by for verification while we resolve this discrepancy." Jessica, still listening to her earpiece, hesitated before echoing the instruction without the same conviction she had earlier. Marcus did not move. Instead, he tapped once on his tablet and sent a brief message. Somewhere beyond the aircraft, Sarah Whitmore received it instantly. Her reply came within seconds. "Protocol acknowledged. System tracking activated." Back in the cabin, Emily lowered her phone slightly, whispering to herself that this was no longer a simple seating issue. The atmosphere had changed again, heavier now, as if the aircraft itself had become aware of a hidden fault in its own structure. Jessica exhaled slowly, her professional certainty beginning to fracture under the pressure of details she could not yet explain. Marcus finally spoke again, his voice still calm, but now unmistakably firm. "You are not dealing with a mistake," he said. And for the first time, neither Jessica nor Ryan responded immediately. The silence that followed Marcus Caldwell's last words did not last long, but it changed the shape of everything inside the cabin. Jessica Moore adjusted her earpiece again, listening more carefully now, her expression tightening as new information came through the internal communication channel. Ryan Blake noticed her hesitation and immediately lowered his voice, trying to reassert control. "We are still within procedure limits," he said, but it sounded more like reassurance to himself than instruction to her. Jessica did not respond right away. Instead, she looked toward the front of the cabin, as if expecting someone else to step in and clarify what was happening. Marcus remained seated, but his attention shifted slightly downward to his tablet, where a single notification had appeared confirming system synchronization. He did not open it yet. He did not need to. Across the aisle, Emily Carter had stopped adjusting her recording angle and was now fully focused, her eyes tracking every reaction between the crew members. She could sense the shift before she could understand it. The way authority in the room was no longer anchored to Jessica or Ryan. A few rows ahead, the cabin intercom light flickered briefly, signaling activity from the cockpit. Inside, Captain Daniel Reeves reviewed the flag passenger entry once more, his focus narrowing as he cross-checked it with the updated flight operations system. The designation attached to Marcus Caldwell was not standard, and it carried a level of access classification that required direct acknowledgment from the cockpit. Daniel leaned back slightly, his hand hovering near the communication switch, hesitation forming for the first time in his routine procedure. In the cabin, Jessica finally spoke again, but her voice had changed. It was no longer firm or directive. It carried uncertainty that she tried to hide. "Sir," she said, "we are receiving updated information from the flight deck that requires clarification." Ryan turned sharply toward her. "What kind of clarification?" he asked, but Jessica did not answer immediately. Her eyes flicked back to Marcus, then briefly to the tablet in his hands, and something about the alignment of those details did not make sense to her anymore. At that exact moment, Sarah Whitmore's voice came through Marcus's internal channel, calm and precise. "All systems confirm identity authorization is active. Flight protocol adjustment has been logged." Marcus gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, still not looking away from the window for more than a moment. The clouds outside seemed unchanged, but everything inside the aircraft felt different, as if the structure of authority itself had been quietly rewritten. Emily lowered her phone slightly, whispering under her breath that this was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a confirmation process unfolding in real time. Jessica stepped half a pace back without realizing it, her professional stance breaking for the first time as she processed what the system was implying. Ryan noticed the shift and tried to regain control once more. "We need a final confirmation before proceeding further," he said, but his voice lacked the confidence it had at the beginning. From the cockpit, Captain Daniel Reeves finally spoke into the internal line, his tone measured but unmistakably serious. "Cabin crew, hold all actions regarding passenger Caldwell. Verify identity through executive clearance channel." The words landed in the cabin like a quiet reset. Jessica froze for a fraction of a second, then slowly turned her head back toward Marcus, seeing him now not as a disputed passenger, but as something the system itself had begun to recognize. And for the first time since boarding began, no one in the cabin moved to challenge the silence. The instruction from the cockpit did not resolve the tension inside the cabin. It only redirected it into a quieter and more dangerous form of uncertainty. Jessica Moore stood still for a moment longer than she should have, her hand hovering near her communication device as she replayed the captain's words in her mind. Executive clearance channel, she repeated under her breath, as if saying it aloud might make it clearer. Ryan Blake shifted his stance beside her, visibly unsettled now, his earlier confidence replaced with cautious silence. Across the aisle, Emily Carter continued recording, but her focus had narrowed, her breathing slower, as she realized she was no longer capturing a simple dispute, but something procedural unfolding at a higher level than she had expected. Marcus Caldwell remained seated, his posture unchanged, his attention still calm and directed outward, but now there was a subtle shift in presence, as if the cabin itself had adjusted around him. A soft tone sounded again in Jessica's earpiece, followed by a second confirmation from the aircraft's internal system. She listened carefully, her eyes widening slightly as she processed the information. Ryan noticed immediately. "What is it?" he asked, but his voice had lost its earlier edge. Jessica hesitated before responding. "The system is confirming executive-level clearance," she said quietly, almost unwilling to fully accept the words herself. The phrase did not belong in routine passenger handling. It belonged in corporate flight authorization, in ownership validation, in records that crew members rarely engaged with directly. Ryan frowned, trying to dismiss it. "That could be a temporary flag," he said quickly, but even he did not sound convinced anymore. At that exact moment, the cockpit communication channel opened again. Captain Daniel Reeves did not speak immediately. There was a brief pause, the kind that signaled verification rather than instruction. When he finally spoke, his tone was different, no longer procedural but precise. "Cabin crew, confirm identity acknowledgement immediately," he said. "This passenger is listed under active executive authority verification. Stand by for confirmation protocol completion." The words moved through the cabin like a controlled reset, and Jessica felt her certainty dissolve completely. She turned slightly toward Marcus again, but now she was not evaluating him. She was reevaluating everything she thought she understood about the situation. Emily lowered her phone just slightly, not stopping the recording but adjusting her grip, her expression reflecting disbelief mixed with anticipation. Marcus finally moved for the first time in several minutes. He placed his tablet on the armrest beside him and leaned back slightly, as if allowing the process to finish on its own terms. There was no expression of satisfaction, no reaction to the shift in tone around him, only a calm acceptance that the system had begun to speak for itself. Sarah Whitmore's voice came through his channel once more, steady and uninterrupted. "Executive confirmation window is now active," she stated. "All crew communications are being logged in real time." Jessica heard the words through her earpiece and instinctively straightened her posture, as if her body was reacting before her mind could fully process the implications. Ryan looked toward the cockpit door, waiting for something more familiar to reassert control, but nothing did. Instead, the atmosphere inside the cabin grew quieter, heavier, and more deliberate, as if every person on board understood that whatever came next would not be a matter of opinion, but of confirmation. The cabin did not react immediately to the activation of Executive Confirmation Protocol, but the air inside Flight 117 grew noticeably heavier, as if every person on board had begun to understand that they were no longer operating inside a routine passenger interaction. Jessica Moore stood perfectly still for a moment, her hand lowered now, her professional posture replaced by a quiet uncertainty she could not fully conceal. Ryan Blake, who had been confident only minutes earlier, now avoided eye contact with both Jessica and Marcus Caldwell, as if searching for a version of events that still made sense under standard procedure. Across the aisle, Emily Carter kept her phone raised, but her expression had changed from curiosity to full concentration, her eyes tracking every subtle reaction in the cabin as if she was witnessing the collapse of an assumption rather than a simple dispute over seating. Marcus remained composed, his hands resting naturally, his gaze calm and steady, as though he had already seen this moment unfold long before it arrived. A soft notification sounded again through Jessica's earpiece, and she instinctively listened more closely than before. This time, there was no ambiguity in the message. The internal system had completed cross-verification against executive authorization records, and the results were no longer pending. Jessica's breathing slowed slightly as she processed what she was hearing, her eyes flicking once more toward Marcus, but this time with hesitation replacing certainty. Ryan finally spoke, his voice lower than before, almost cautious. "We should wait for final confirmation from the cockpit," he said. But even he seemed to understand that the confirmation was no longer in question, only in presentation. At that moment, Captain Daniel Reeves re-entered the communication channel, his voice now steady but definitive. "Cabin crew," he said, "final verification has been completed. Passenger Caldwell holds active executive authority status tied to Horizon Aviation Holdings." The words did not carry emotion, but their effect inside the cabin was immediate and unmistakable. Jessica closed her eyes briefly, not in disbelief, but in realization. Ryan stepped back half a pace without meaning to, the physical response betraying the mental shift happening inside him. Emily lowered her phone slightly, not stopping the recording, but acknowledging internally that what she was capturing had moved beyond a misunderstanding and into something far more structural. Marcus finally turned his head toward the aisle, not to confront, not to assert, but simply to observe the change in atmosphere around him. Jessica spoke again, but her voice had lost its earlier authority completely. "Acknowledged," she said softly, almost automatically, as if responding to a system that no longer required interpretation. The cabin remained silent for a long moment, not because anyone had been instructed to be silent, but because no one was certain what level of authority remained to be questioned. Ryan looked toward Jessica, then toward the front of the cabin, but did not speak again. The structure of control that had existed minutes earlier was no longer intact, and in its place was a recognition that the situation had already moved beyond their ability to define it. The confirmation from the cockpit did not bring relief, it brought structure, and that structure immediately changed how everyone inside the cabin behaved. Jessica Moore stood with her hands now fully lowered, her earlier procedural authority replaced by a quiet recognition that the situation was no longer within her decision-making range. Ryan Blake had stopped speaking entirely, his attention divided between the cockpit door and Marcus Caldwell, as if trying to locate where his understanding of the hierarchy had failed. Emily Carter remained still with her phone held at chest level, continuing to record, but her expression had shifted again, now reflecting a careful awareness that she was witnessing a reversal of assumed authority rather than a simple correction of identity. Marcus remained composed, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, as if he had already accounted for every stage of what was unfolding long before anyone else in the cabin had begun to react. A brief pause passed through the aircraft, the kind of silence that is not requested but naturally forms when people realize they are no longer certain who is in control of the room. Then, the cockpit communication channel opened again. Captain Daniel Reeves spoke with a tone that was no longer procedural but formal in a way that signaled closure on the verification process. "Cabin crew," he said, "executive confirmation is complete. All systems have verified passenger Caldwell's authority. Continue operations under executive protocol awareness." Jessica absorbed the instruction without responding immediately. Her eyes shifted once toward Marcus, then away, as if acknowledging internally that her role in this interaction had been fully concluded. Ryan took a step back toward his assigned position without being instructed to do so, the movement subtle but clear, reflecting a shift from active intervention to passive observation. Across the aisle, Emily lowered her phone slightly, not ending the recording, but adjusting her focus as the narrative she was capturing transitioned from conflict to resolution. Marcus finally reached forward and reopened his tablet, not to issue commands, but to review what had already been logged. The screen displayed a series of completed confirmations, timestamps, and authorization acknowledgments, all aligned under a unified executive clearance status. He did not react outwardly to any of it. Instead, he simply observed, as if confirming that the system had done exactly what it was designed to do without deviation. Jessica finally spoke again, her voice quiet and controlled. "Acknowledged," she said, but this time the word carried no instruction, only acceptance. Ryan nodded slightly without speaking, his earlier assumptions no longer present in his expression. The cabin settled into a different kind of silence now, not tense, but transitional, as if everyone on board understood that the structure they had been operating under had been replaced by something final and non-negotiable. Marcus leaned back into his seat once more, his attention returning to the window where the sky remained unchanged, indifferent to the shift that had taken place inside the aircraft. And for the first time since boarding, no one attempted to correct his position, his presence, or his right to remain exactly where he was. The moment executive confirmation settled into the cabin, the atmosphere shifted again, not toward tension, but toward irreversible recognition. Jessica Moore remained in place by the aisle, but her posture had softened into full professional withdrawal, as if every instruction she once held authority over had been reassigned to a higher layer she no longer had access to. Ryan Blake stood slightly behind her now, no longer attempting to interpret or intervene, his focus fixed on the cockpit door as though waiting for the final procedural closure that would define his next action. Emily Carter continued recording, her device steady, her expression no longer reacting to surprises, but documenting confirmation, aware that what she was capturing had moved into a different category of importance. Marcus Caldwell remained seated exactly as before, but the silence around him had changed in meaning. It was no longer the silence of doubt or resistance. It was the silence of acknowledgment. A soft chime came through the aircraft system, followed by a brief update across the internal communication network confirming that executive protocol awareness had been fully applied to all cabin crew stations. Jessica heard it clearly in her earpiece, and for a moment she did not respond at all. She simply stood there, absorbing the finality of it. Ryan exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering as the pressure of expectation released from him without instruction. From the cockpit, Captain Daniel Reeves maintained a steady tone as he issued the final operational directive. Cabin crew, maintain standard service protocol under executive oversight conditions, he said, reinforcing that the situation was no longer active dispute but resolved status. Jessica finally nodded, not toward anyone in particular, but as acknowledgment to the system itself. Emily lowered her phone slightly, not because she stopped recording, but because the urgency of capturing conflict had been replaced by the significance of capturing resolution. Marcus shifted his tablet slightly on the armrest, glancing at the final confirmation logs. The interface displayed full authorization alignment, identity verification completion, and executive oversight activation across the flight manifest. He did not interact with it further. Instead, he leaned back into his seat, his expression unchanged, as if the entire sequence had unfolded exactly as expected from the beginning. Jessica finally spoke, her voice now quiet and respectful rather than procedural. "Understood," she said, stepping slightly away from the aisle, signaling a return to standard positioning rather than enforcement. Ryan followed suit, repositioning himself further down the cabin, his earlier assumptions fully dissolved. The space around Marcus no longer carried uncertainty or resistance. It carried confirmation. Emily watched for a moment longer, then steadied her phone again, recognizing that what remained was no longer escalation, but aftermath. Marcus turned his gaze back toward the window, where the sky stretched uninterrupted, indifferent to the shift that had just occurred inside the aircraft. And in the cabin behind him, no one spoke further, because there was nothing left to correct. The cabin settled into a new rhythm that no longer resembled uncertainty or escalation, but instead a structured quiet that followed confirmed authority. Jessica Moore remained positioned near the aisle, yet her movements had become careful and restrained, as if every action now required alignment with a system above her direct control. Ryan Blake stayed further back, no longer attempting to interpret or guide the situation, his earlier assumptions replaced by a cautious awareness that the interaction had fully transitioned into executive oversight. Emily Carter continued recording, her device steady, but her focus had shifted from conflict to consequence, understanding that what she was witnessing was not a confrontation, but a procedural correction unfolding in real time. Marcus Caldwell remained seated in the same position he had held since the beginning, calm and unchanging, his presence now blending into the environment not as a disputed passenger, but as a confirmed authority within it. A soft chime echoed through the aircraft intercom system, followed by a brief operational message confirming that executive protocol awareness remained active for the duration of the flight. The tone of the message was neutral, but its effect on the cabin crew was immediate. Jessica acknowledged it with a small nod, her expression composed but fully adjusted to the reality that her role had shifted from decision-making to execution of standard service procedures under oversight conditions. Ryan exhaled slowly and adjusted his position once more, now fully aligned with routine operations. From the cockpit, Captain Daniel Reeves maintained steady communication with cabin operations, his voice consistent and controlled as he confirmed that flight conditions had returned to standard service structure under executive supervision. There was no urgency in his tone, only clarity, as if confirming that a system had successfully stabilized after a controlled update. Emily briefly lowered her phone, then raised it again, recognizing that the story was no longer about disruption but about resolution and accountability within a controlled environment. Marcus finally turned slightly toward the aisle, not to address anyone, but to observe the cabin as it had settled around him. The expressions of the crew reflected understanding rather than resistance, and the movement within the cabin resumed in a measured and professional manner. Jessica took a step back toward her assigned station, her voice now soft and formal as she confirmed standard service readiness. Ryan followed suit, returning to his position with quiet compliance. There was no further discussion, no attempt to revisit earlier assumptions, only the acknowledgement that the structure governing the interaction had been fully established and accepted. Emily steadied her recording one last time, capturing the final state of the cabin where uncertainty had been replaced by procedural order. Marcus leaned back once more, his gaze returning to the window where the sky remained unchanged, distant, and uninterrupted. Inside the aircraft, everything had been corrected not through confrontation, but through confirmation, and the silence that followed was no longer tension, but resolution. The cabin remained in a state of quiet procedural order as Flight 117 continued its course, the earlier disruption now fully absorbed into a structured silence that no longer required interpretation. Jessica Moore stood at her assigned position, her posture fully reset to standard service alignment, her earlier uncertainty replaced by a calm acknowledgement of resolved authority. Ryan Blake moved through the cabin with measured steps, no longer engaging in analysis or intervention, only routine oversight as required under executive protocol conditions. Emily Carter remained seated, her phone still recording, though her expression had softened into a reflective focus, aware that what she had captured was no longer an unfolding conflict, but a completed transition of power dynamics within a controlled environment. Marcus Caldwell remained seated exactly as before, his presence unchanged, his attention resting quietly toward the window where the sky stretched without interruption. There was no further challenge, no procedural correction, and no additional verification requests from the crew, as all systems had already completed executive confirmation and stabilized into standard operational flow. A final internal system notification moved through the aircraft network, confirming that executive oversight status remained active and acknowledged across all cabin stations until landing. Jessica received the message and gave a subtle confirming nod, her expression steady and fully aligned with operational requirements. Ryan acknowledged the same update without comment, his role now entirely procedural and silent. From the cockpit, Captain Daniel Reeves issued the final routine status confirmation, his voice calm and fully normalized, indicating that all cabin operations were proceeding under standard flight conditions with executive awareness protocols in place. Emily slowly lowered her phone for the first time in several minutes, not out of disengagement, but out of recognition that the moment of change had already concluded. Marcus shifted slightly in his seat, adjusting his tablet to rest at his side, his posture relaxed but deliberate, as if closing a process that had reached its natural endpoint. No further communication followed, and the aircraft returned to the steady rhythm of flight, where service, observation, and control now operated in complete synchronization. Jessica moved down the aisle once more, performing standard checks with quiet precision, while Ryan followed at a distance, ensuring all procedures remained consistent with updated protocol awareness. Emily remained seated, her recording now passive, capturing only the continuation of a flight that had already defined its turning point. Marcus remained still, his gaze returning to the horizon beyond the window, where nothing reflected the events that had just concluded inside the aircraft. And as Flight 117 continued forward, the cabin carried a final and lasting understanding that the system had not changed through force, but through confirmation, leaving behind a silence that was no longer uncertainty, but completion.